This podcast is a project of the Medina Focus, with the goal of providing space for collaboration and community among practitioners to the Muslim diaspora in North America. As people around the world have immigrated to the West, many Christians have realized that they live and work in the midst of the nations, and they often feel alone and unprepared to communicate cross-culturally. If you're looking for conversation and community surrounding issues of loving Muslim friends in Jesus' name, we welcome you into the conversation.
Hey everyone, this is Brian. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited about our topic today. We get to talk about mobilization, not just mobilization, but mobilization amongst the global South, specifically Latin America. And I think this is certainly a challenge. I know many agencies that are based in the North or based in the West or based in Europe that continually talk about how do we mobilize the global South, how do we incorporate the global South into what we're doing in a greater way. And I think sometimes we just have mismatched cultures, and it's really hard to understand. Culture is kind of like water to a fish or grammar to a language, where it's just this unseen thing, this unseen force that guides and directs everything we think, and we're typically relatively unaware of it. I serve at a multi-ethnic church. It's one of the hats I wear, and I've noticed that for many of our people, they will say yes in very different ways. So I could, for instance, have a trip headed overseas to the Far East, and I could feel good about myself when I offer the trip to the church, and I see 10 hands very readily go up. But in certain cultures, they are not quick to put their hands up, and many mobilizers get frustrated with trying to figure out, why won't this group join us? What is wrong with them is often how it goes sorted out in our minds. And I think many times we just don't understand the cultural differences. I have friends from India, and they tell me that to invite someone to your birthday party, you would send out an evite to the village where you live, so you might send out 300-400 invitations. My response was, well, I mean, gosh, what do you do with 300 or 400 people showing up at a kid's birthday party? They go, no, that's not how it works. You send out the evite to everyone. It's an honor-shame culture. You don't want to leave someone out. Everyone needs to be honored and invited, but obviously that's not very practical to have that many people to a birthday party. And so the people that are really supposed to be there get a phone call. And I've noticed in my own work here, if I send out a group email, I will get a particular response. If I start calling people individually, I will get a very different response. Sometimes it's based around task. If I call people to do something that makes a lot of sense to me but not to them, the response isn't so great, or the response follows cultural lines. If I call people to do something like pray, that opens the door for more global participation, because this is how many cultures, I would say rightly, are wired. And so our guest today is Dave, and he's going to be sharing with us about the work that he and his wife do. And so they have a twofold burden, which is to reach the unengaged peoples of Central Asia. That's one side. And on the other side is to empower the apostolically gifted Latinos to live out their cross-cultural calling. They've, in the course of this, they've launched a network that advocates for this Central Asian unreached people group throughout Latin America. And they mobilize churches and candidates to serve this unreached people group throughout Latin America. This has led to the need for a training program in both Spanish and Portuguese, so that locals can be trained in their heart language. And now the next step in this evolution is to launch a sending agency that is based in Latin America that is sending these candidates overseas. So we're very excited to hear what he has to say. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Brian. It's wonderful being here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. Hey, so Dave, just to start with, tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Well, I think you summarized in a great way, but to put it a bit more succinctly, there is a group of people in Central Asia that don't know Jesus, and they must. And so what we're trying to do is find people in Latin America that have a calling to serve as missionaries, and doing anything and everything it takes to get them to this people group to be light bearers and gospel bearers amongst them.
So from our previous conversations, a lot of the mobilization work that you're doing is taking a little different track. And we like the word risk, not in a bad way, but in the sense of kind of stepping out on faith and trying something new, being willing to experiment and maybe even fail in order to find and obey God and find where He has us going. So, what risks are you taking in your ministry?
Oh gosh, that is a great question. I think there's lots of risks that we take. To start with, I go back to the very beginning when we were thinking about starting this network to mobilize Latinos, Latin Americans to this people group in Central Asia. At that point, as far as I knew, to my very limited knowledge of people in Latin America at that point, there was no other people-specific group network that just mobilized people towards a specific people group. There were a few large organizations that had mobilizers that said, hey, come work for organization, and then I'll give you this 10 different options of where you can go. Mobilizers didn't say, hey, I have one group I'm passionate about, come work with them, and if you don't, we don't really want to work with you because we're so laser focused on this group. So a big risk on the front end was, can we do mobilization this way? Another risk at that point is nobody else from Latin America when we started was really focused on sending people to this people group. I mean, there was maybe 3-4 workers in this part of Central Asia from Latin America, but nobody was trying to actively bring more people to the field. And so, the question was always there, why? Maybe somebody else has tried it and they found out that it couldn't be done, or it was too hard, or they got, there was some challenge that we weren't aware of. But the first risk we took was just jumping right in and saying, can we try doing this? Can we try raising awareness for this group and take it one step at a time?
So what have you been doing to raise awareness for this group?
So like going back to the last thing I said, one step at a time. So the first thing we did is there was one prayer guide for this people group that was in English, and that's really all we had a handle on that we knew we could share without compromising security. And so this thing literally started with me and my mom translating this thing. So we translated this prayer guide, we put it into Spanish, and we said, okay, we have a little bit of information about this group now in Spanish. Maybe we can get it out to a few people. So we started asking around. Now this is just me, not my mom, me and my wife, I guess. A couple of different churches, missions organizations, other people. Who do you know that's passionate about this group, or who do you know that's working within this group? And we realized most of them said, we have no idea who this group is. And all we did on the front end was give them this prayer guide and say, pray for them, we'll see what happens. That led to me being able to go on 2 conferences to speak about these people, one in Colombia and one in Brazil. And they were in large conferences, 200, 300 people at the most each. And at the end of this, we had like 40, 50 candidates that said, I want to go serve these people. And then we were faced with the next risk. They looked back at us and they said, how do I get there? And all we knew was what was in that guide. We have very little to go on at that point.
So this all started with prayer, and now you've got to figure out how are you going to obey? How are you going to follow God?
Yeah, that's the thing that's kind of funny looking back. It's we prayed, we invited other people to pray, and God responded. And we were extremely not ready for God to respond at that point, giving us the candidates that were ready to go. And so the first thing we did with them is we said, well, prayers worked thus far. We doubled down on that. We got them all together virtually every week to pray for these people and to pray for each other in their journey to this people. And little by little, God uses very people that want to go to start getting organized. We were able to use them to translate more information about Central Asia to Spanish, to Portuguese, to get them aligned and ready to go. We were able to start finding creative ways to serve other workers that were on the field already through prayer, through encouragement, through support. We even, by this point, have been able to develop a training program for people directly from Spanish, directly from Portuguese, to learn the language of this people group out here in Georgia, which those languages, that people group's language and Spanish and Portuguese, had never overlapped before in terms of formal training anywhere in the world.
Right. You highlight something very interesting here, and I think this is often missed by Western, and when I say Western in this call, I mean Northwestern agencies, and that is we tend, and I'll throw myself in there with there, we tend to be goal-driven, objective-driven, and so when our version of mobilization very often looks like let's present the facts and figures, and let's agree to go. Let's figure out the resources. It's kind of a pull yourself up by your own bootstraps approach. And one thing I've learned, I currently serve at a multi-ethnic church. One thing I've learned here is different cultures are motivated to obey God differently, different ways. And one thing we often talk about, the role of prayer and evangelism or discipleship, or in kind of the function of ministry, a need for God's power. And sometimes we forget the role of prayer and mobilization. And so I think it's interesting that you're calling people to pray, and out from that is coming all of these other kind of next steps. Or that's actually kind of part of my next question. Is a lot of times in ministry we're thinking we're going to do a particular project, and we might even be doing that, and whether that succeeds or fails is kind of irrelevant, because we see God kind of make a slight veer off the course, or sometimes a dramatic veer off the course, and it becomes something else. So what are the unintended outcomes or events that have come from what you're working on?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. To go back to the last thing you said about prayer and mobilization, I think that part was key for us, but I can't take credit for that. I invited all those candidates to pray with me because we had no other recourse. There was no other plan for us to follow at that point but pray and wait for God to show us his doors. But he did, and that's what led to us thinking we're just going to raise awareness in Latin America. My thinking at the beginning was, we'll let the people know, and they'll find a way to go. And so if they just find out about this, if God touches them, their churches, their organizations, their agencies, they will find a way to place people on the field. What I hadn't realized is there was no structure for them to go yet, and that's why they weren't going. So we created the need, we created this burden, this urging them to go, and now we needed to help them find a way to actually get there. So what shifted from only awareness for us, really what we end up doing now is mobilization and recruiting. We end up doing training. We're in the middle of developing a sending agency functionally in Latin America that will specialize in just sending Latinos to this people group. So we are doing a much broader stroke of the things needed to get Latinos from their home context to actually be gospel heralds in Central Asia.
So what are the greatest challenges in trying to accomplish this?
So, I mean, each season has its own challenges. Right now, this may be dated a few months from now, who knows? But right now, in the midst of this coronavirus craze, two things have come up which are huge. A lot of what we did for raising awareness, mobilizing, and training was event-based. And of course, now everybody's stuck at home. So we, like many others in ministry, have had to drastically change how we do those things. But the second thing that we are seeing as a big challenge right now is churches in Latin America. In many places, because they're cash economies, people don't really depend on banks or use bank accounts, and definitely don't do online giving. Churches and missionaries that are going or are in the field have seen their income or their supply of funds cut off for the season that everybody's stuck at home. And so a lot of our candidates have had that same issue. So there's a new issue right there, a new challenge that we're seeing threatening our ministry right now. But I think at a much more transcendental mentality, I think that the biggest challenge for us consistently is to hear God clearly as to what he wants us to do next and what he wants us to focus on, and tune out those voices that aren't quite aligned with him, even if they come from people that we love and respect in our context. A lot of times, us in the Latino context, we're very communal. And so we tend to value the opinions of others, especially others in leadership or authority, very highly. But that's not always the right voices to listen to. There's people that in our journey as an organization and the journey for candidates that are very risk averse, that have a slightly different agenda or fears about the path that you're taking, that may have good ideas, but they're not specifically God's calling for your life, or have other projects or passions that could be distractions for us or lead us to vision drift. And we've had to really be careful throughout the whole process and really involved in prayer to be able to know, how do we hear God and hear his best instead of just hear something that's just good enough.
So in Muslim ministry, as I'm sure you're aware, there are multiple camps, multiple methodologies, philosophies, etc., and there's lots of disagreements among each of these categories. How do you navigate these disagreements?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because as we work with people, whether it's diaspora in the States, which we're doing in Georgia, or if it's in some of the most complex parts of the world, like Central Asia would be a great example of a persecuted context. There's a lot of different practices around not only cultural decisions and the C scale and things like that, where people want to look at just how do things look like, or what is a success supposed to look like, but things like security and keeping your family's identity healthy and responsive to the point that you don't get kicked out or threatened and have to leave the context you're in. And with people with various needs and various freedoms, there's always going to be conflict. For us, really what it is we understand that each person, each platform, each team, each context is different. We know that our rule or guide really is the word. And as long as something falls within the parameters of the word, we're free to experiment and be creative and be bold in our risk taking. That doesn't mean that we think everybody should be trying to push the edge of the boundary of wherever they are, which for us in other places that does work well. But it just means we're free to try to be aggressive in our risk taking, or we're free to hold back for seasons and just see how other people are doing things. We're free to collaborate with others that are aligned with what we're doing, and we're free to keep our distance if what they're doing and we're doing just aren't meant to intersect that much. We just find a lot of freedom within the parameters of the Bible to just be creative, to be bold, to be entrepreneurial, and just do a series of iterations and experiments. And when something fails, great, that means we learn something new, and we just get to move on all the wiser and try something again.
Yeah, I think when people think about mobilization, we're obviously always starting from our own starting point, right? Our own frame of reference. We're looking at things that have been done before, and so for many in the North, when they think of Latin America, they think this is a place that we go and we serve. And I think for many Latin Americans, this is actually one of the challenges that they have to overcome in taking that step of obedience to serve God cross-culturally, is that's also been the view pressed on them, is this is something that the Northerners come down here and do. It's not something that we go. So how do you transcend that challenge in your context? And also kind of a side question to that is what do you see as the benefits to mobilizing Latinos? What do they bring to the table?
Yeah, so that's two great questions right there. So the first one, how do we navigate that challenge? Let me tell you, really, it's a hard battle. I'll give you an example. I was in Costa Rica last year, and I was in a church in San Jose, sharing with them, saying, hey, you guys can be missionaries going to Central Asia, doing all these things, and we're talking strategy, and they're getting excited and they're getting involved, and they're saying, we could really do this. And a couple weeks later, we leave another group, a church, I think it's a youth group from, I think it was Texas, came to this same city, to the same church, and basically ran a BVS for them, as if they didn't know how to, run a Sunday school. The church has been open for, I think, over a decade. I mean, they've got this thing down and locked. And, this group of youth group kids come in and are running this thing for them, trying to teach them how to do things. And at least for those 2 weeks that they were there, all the people that I was working with, the volunteers that were ready to go, just got sucked into all these random tasks at the church because of an event that had to happen, which, after this group left, we look back, the impact on the church growth wasn't significant. But their perspective of, no, we still need other people to teach us how to do this, was that cut a little bit deeper for them. And so we're constantly having to remind them of that. No, we've been part of the harvest for a while, but those seeds that grow need to fall on the ground again and die to self and sprout new growth for the kingdom. And so that's something that through a series of stories, teachings, analogies, we try to convey and keep forefront in the minds of our people. And the other thing that I think really is key for that is nothing teaches them that they're valuable, that they can provide value like success. when you empower people to get involved, to mobilize, to pray, to serve in ways that are accessible to them, in ways that make an impact and show some quick results, then that's it. They have their own testimony of, hey, I did A, B, C, and D, and here's what I had to show for it. This network now, it's not me going church to church mobilizing. I've empowered people in several countries, done them, you're the mobilizer for a network now here. Now go and do likewise. And they just go and they do things, and God moves. And suddenly it's not me telling them you can do this. They've seen they can do this with God's help. And so they believe it themselves. So empowerment is key to show them really, no, God can work with you and can work through you, regardless of anybody else helping you. What was the second part of that question?
So I think maybe this has to do more with Northerners' image or understanding, awareness. What is it that Latinos bring to the table in participating in global mission?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you are a North American. I'll give you a bit of an extreme example. Grew up in a suburb of, I don't know, Boise, Idaho. You live there all your life. You go to a Christian school, Christian college. You graduate. You say, okay, I want to go live now in the middle of Pakistan, or in the middle of Somalia, or in the middle of China. Mm-hmm. Your life is going to look vastly different than it did back home.
Right.
You may be in a place where you don't have power all the time, where back home maybe you did. You may not have running water or clean water accessible to you easily in some areas. You may have a life where there's this political instability and people don't trust the government, and they have legitimate reasons to do so, or they may be in the middle of a war. And that's all new to you, and that may just give you such a shock that you don't know how to operate, much less serve the people of that community at that point. A lot of our candidates from Latin America, places like Colombia, Venezuela right now, Peru in the past, and so on and so forth. Dominican Republic, they've grown up in context of a lot of political instability, mm-hmm. insurgency, and even terrorism. And so you tell them a story of the field, and it's not really all that much different from back home. And if they know how to operate back home, if they know how to live and go about life, not only that, if they know how to serve and minister and share the gospel in their context, going to a place that's similar, they have an advantage of adapting quicker, adapting faster, and knowing how to meet some of those top needs. Mm-hmm. Having a communal culture as well on the field in most places, as well as in Latin America, we have a communal culture that's honor and shame. It's relationally driven, not time driven. In contrast to maybe the Western world, gives us a lot of assumptions that we will make about our life, be things that fit in some way or another within this new culture we're going to. So there is those advantages for us, definitely. And then there's the simpler advantages. Brian, if you were walking down the street in the middle of, I don't know, Kabul, Afghanistan, just the way that you look versus me, if we're both dressed in the local garb, I could pass for a local. I have black hair, mm-hmm. dark skin, and so on. You probably won't.
Yeah, I have no hair.
There you go. And so there's all these little things that are there on the plus side. I think on the flip side, one of the things that we sometimes neglect to think about is that for every good thing, there's probably also a challenge that we need to embrace and we need to overcome. Mm-hmm. The Latin world, be able to fund somebody to go overseas is much harder. Mm-hmm. The historical experience cross-culturally, it's much shorter. And so the church broadly is still figuring out how to do this and how to do this in hard places. And the church body isn't trained to understand how giving to missionaries or how sending people works, because it's not part of their everyday life, like it is in many healthy churches in North America. And so there is some hardships as well. And that's why I really think that Westerners, Latinos, people from other parts of the global South or the global church, we need to partner with each other, and each one of us brings our strengths, and we let others mitigate our weaknesses to really be able to make this thing work.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. So in these many circles that you live in, right? You've got your church circle, your organization circle. I'm sure you have Muslim friends and have been in country before. how do you navigate your identity across all of these different categories?
That's a great question, because you do have to be a very different person depending on where you are. You know, if I'm in Colombia and I'm sharing about missions, I'm publicly, openly this believer, this missionary, this person that's advocating for bringing the gospel to Central Asia. But if I were to go to Central Asia and try to apply for a visa or walk down the street and somebody asks me what you do for a living, I can't give them the same answers I would want to offer in Latin America. And that's not lying. That's just simply the reality of what it is. So one of the things that I personally do and a lot of our people in our teams do is we stay away from social media. Social media is a tool, is something that we could use when it's beneficial and something we can avoid when it's harmful. And in the case of our ministry, usually doesn't add a lot of benefits, or at the very least, the downside of some very public media forums overcome the benefits of them for us. And so I'm personally not online a lot in those platforms that are more public. But I also think about being open and honest with people about who I am without compromising my security of maybe others that are hosting me in a country where I'm traveling to or I'm working alongside of. So, for example, if a local Muslim friend were to ask me, what do you do for a living? I told them that I work with an NGO and I help other NGOs develop the strategy to fulfill their purposes, fulfill their vision. So it goes along the lines of consulting, and I talk about what that's like in my world to some degree. I don't really talk about the fact that most of those NGOs are churches or missions organizations and that they're religious exclusively and are doing missions. But I'm not lying either. You know, I'm not in business. I'm not a professional. I work for an NGO. And when I travel to see one of the people that I work with. And so for the people around me, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we can be as honest as we can. But I think that somehow that American or that Western, mentality of the truth and nothing but the truth is good, but all the truth sometimes isn't helpful. We tend to overshare,
right?
And we tend to feel guilty if we don't overshare sometimes, and it's okay. If you ask me at the beginning of the call, how's your day going, or what did you do today? You don't want a play-by-play of the last 10 hours.
Right.
You simply want me to give you a 1 or 2 word answer, and I've been polite, you've been polite, and we move on. And so a lot of the questions around identity that we get asked, we can answer them the same way, being completely honest, and a lot of those concerns would go away.
Mm-hmm. So you're based in Atlanta, and
Mm-hmm.
you're mobilizing across Latin America, and you're focused on Central Asia. Add a second layer to all of that, which is that you are kind of in startup. You're probably have like the cultural ethos of a startup in terms of hours and innovation, and you're kind of dealing with a blank page where you get to, it's fun, you get to color in all the lines, but it's probably also exhausting. So how do you maintain a healthy work-life balance?
Oh, I would say it's a lot of fun. That being able to draw the lines in some ways yourself, that means that you get to make a lot of decisions, and it's really exciting. But also, it's whenever something goes wrong, you got to look in the mirror. That's a fantastic question. I think that the work-life balance is key, and I don't know that I like the word balance as much, because I think of a scale with 2 sides, and I don't think that we ever hit this perfect balance where everything is in equilibrium. And if we do, I don't know how long it lasts. It just takes a little pandemic to throw it all out of whack again.
Right.
And so, but what I do think it's that having this, being an integral person, and maybe integrating work and life in a way that's healthy, that the things that you stand for at work are the things that you believe, and you stand for those things as well in your personal life. So for me, one of those things is thriving. I want to do an excellent job. And I only do that if my house is in order. I only do that if my spiritual walk is in order. I only do that if I get enough rest and eat healthy and all those things. And so they're not necessarily competing for time, but they're building off each other. And really the way that I make sure that I'm staying on track, to say it that way, in those things, is that I look to have experienced mentors, and especially spiritual direction, to have people around me that are a lot wiser, that have done similar things before, that have made some of the mistakes that if I were to go unchecked, I was probably going to make. And I'm being constant communication with them to track how I'm doing, to see where I'm going, and have all those checks and balances in place so that when something is slightly off where it should be, it immediately gets checked on, adjusted, and we can just move on.
Yeah. So a lot of this might feel really theoretical for some of the listeners of, what does it look like to live in one place and mobilize in another to reach a third place. Can you put this into a story for us?
So here's an example. I think this is a good story of just how God works. So there was a point maybe 2 years ago when we were starting to think about creating this training program in Atlanta for Latinos to learn the heart language of this group, completely bypassing English. And we had just discovered that there is this pocket of refugees from this people group here in Atlanta. And we said, we want to be there. And we want to be able to have a training there where our candidates can go and be immersed in the midst of this people group. At that point, my wife and I lived in the Midwest, and we weren't really able to relocate all that easily back then. And so we were saying, let's just hold off on developing this until we can actually move down there. But I was challenged by a mentor, to go back to my last question, having people to help you think well, to say, hey, you're training people remotely in Latin America to mobilize. Why don't you equip somebody remotely to run this program in Atlanta while you're still in the Midwest? So functionally, to give you a quick idea as to what that would mean that we needed to find somebody living in Atlanta, working with this people group that spoke Spanish and was willing to jump on board with us at this startup of launching a new project, and just be all in, running the hands-on from day one. This was a very tall order. I mean, to begin with, there's not a lot of people working with this group. As far as we knew, there were only a couple of doing this in Atlanta, and neither one of them spoke Spanish. But in the midst of this, we're praying through this process and saying, God, please bring us somebody. Unbeknownst to us, right around that time, actually a few months earlier, this couple had moved to Atlanta from Oklahoma. He was native from Oklahoma and she was from Mexico, and they met while he was serving as a missionary in Mexico for several years. And so they got married down there, had kids, had moved back to Oklahoma. And a few months before we had this prayer, they had just moved to Atlanta to start working with a refugee community. Unbeknownst to them, they moved to an apartment complex where the majority of the people were from this unreached people group that we are targeting to reach. And for them, they were just their neighbors, and they started befriending them and just really fell in love with working with these people. By the time I met them, a couple of days after these prayers started, they had probably felt a burden for about a week, not years, not months, just a week of God saying, you're working with Muslims in your area. I want you to find a way to integrate that with training Latinos to go overseas. They had no idea how to do that. We had no idea how we're going to find these people. And all it took was somebody saying, hey, you two should talk. And suddenly their prayer was answered, our prayer was answered. A couple weeks later, we drove down there to meet with them face to face. And we literally sat in the room, I think for 4 days, 10 hours each, hashing out every single detail we needed to put that program together. Because that's really what it is when you trust God and you pray, doesn't matter if you're in the Midwest or Atlanta or Latin America or Central Asia, he can move. He's already present wherever you need to be. That's right. And so he puts those things together in place.
Yeah. Wow. That reminds me, when I was headed to the Middle East years ago, there was someone asking me if I was taking God there. Or something, I forgot exactly how they phrased it, but it was something like that. And I remember answering back about God is already there. I mean, what kind of person do you think I am if I'm going somewhere that God is not? I think often we forget that he's already at work. We just have to be open to him leading us. So yeah. What's something that you've discovered during your time mobilizing Latinos that you think other practitioners could learn from?
Well, I think that the main thing that I would like to share is just try. Whatever it is that your passion is as you're listening to this, God has created you in a very unique way and potentially with a very unique burden to do something in this world that he has for you. And so if you're one of those people that say, I have this vision of what could be, and I have no idea how to get there, just try and fail and try again and fail again and keep on going. And that's fine, because every time you try and fail, you're going to learn something new you didn't know before, and you can get back up and adjust and keep going. What I've really discovered, to answer your question, is that God really meets us as we're walking in faith. But if we're not going anywhere, we can't get to wherever God is already working, because we're just stagnant. So as we move in faith, in listening, in obedience, in risk, in steps of faith, that's where we find where God is already working. And that's just such a joyful and such an exciting place to be. For us, it's this group in Central Asia, but for you, there might be a need, whether it's, a social need of a group of people that are oppressed or neglected or hurting or unreached, or maybe it's, Muslims in North America that need you to be obedient to God, to be able to have access to his grace. And if you don't take risks, if you don't jump out there and do things that sound crazy or scary, or you've never tried them before, well, you're their path to Christ. And God could move without you, sure, but he wants to use you, and he's waiting for you. And on their side, whoever it is that you're going to bless with your ministry, don't let them miss out on God and knowing him intimately now, not tomorrow, not next year, not 10 years from now, because you were afraid to try.
So if God would answer one prayer with a yes, what would you ask?
So what I would love to see is an outcome of a gospel movement amongst this people group in Central Asia. I would just like to see an explosion of the gospel where people are coming to know Jesus and they're sharing that with others, and it's multiplying beyond what we could expect or imagine or even measure at that point. That's really where my heart is. But I think another part of that is that I would love to see that happen through the empowerment of people that are just bold in listening to God. I think that people that are entrepreneurial, and that's what we call apostolic, entrepreneurial people that are aggressively willing to live their lives in a dramatic, drastic, unhinged faith, I think that would be an amazing story. And that's what we're trying to build towards, if God allows it.
That's good. Well, Dave, I've certainly enjoyed our conversation, and I think I've learned a lot about mobilization. I hope others have as well. And I certainly look forward to going deeper with you as time goes on and hearing updates from you over time. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Okay, well, that's a wrap. I hope that these lessons that Dave has shared about prayer, the Holy Spirit, obeying God, living relationally have been applicable to you, whether you are mobilizing locally, cross-culturally, or overseas cross-culturally. We hope that this has been helpful to you. Leave us a line and let us know what you think, and we hope that you will join us again next time.
You've been listening to the Medina podcast. This show is hosted by Brian Hebert and produced by Nate Schultz. The conversations we have on this program are born out of an expanding environment of collaboration among grassroots ministry practitioners across the North American continent. If you would like to engage on a deeper level, please email us at medinafocus@vision59.com.